With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right. Even if the whole world is telling you to move. It is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say no. You move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us on this Thursday. And as you all know, Thursday is a very important day for us because we always have a guest to join us as well. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and go to our friend Becky Gerritson of Eagle Forum, Alabama, to give us an update on what is going on in the state legislature. Good afternoon, Becky.
Good afternoon. How are you doing?
Doing fine. I almost told you good morning there. I'm still adjusting from when I was on morning radio.
I do that all the time, too.
All right.
The days just go too fast. It always feels like morning.
Yeah, it feels all compressed to me. But I was really surprised that you were getting a hearing already today. We were talking a little bit earlier about this off air, that there was a hearing going on the lottery bill already.
Yes. And actually, a new lottery bill just got dropped, so it was in committee as well. We knew about the first bill for about a week or two, so that's not too surprising, but this other bill was in the same committee as well. It's kind of a competing bill. But Eagle Forum's position on the lottery is we are against it, and we can go through some of those reasons, but there were quite a few people who testified this morning. Believe it or not, there were actually more that testified against the lottery than for the lottery. So that was kind of encouraging for me to see. But can I tell you about the two different bills?
Yeah, I would actually like if you would give us just a little insight into the nuances kind of between the two of them. Yeah.
Sure. Well, the first bill, there's two bills actually that were dropped by Senator McClendon. And one of them is a constitutional amendment because currently we are not allowed to have lotteries in Alabama. So one of the bills will actually allow for a lottery, and that will be a constitutional amendment, so people will vote on that. Right. But then the other bill kind of set up the ins and outs of how the lottery would work and what would be allowed in there. And so in that bill, a lottery would be allowed. And that's like the paper lotteries that most people are familiar with that you can buy at the gas stations or, places like that. But this bill also allows for video terminals to be set up in areas in Alabama where we already have like racetracks. There's 5 counties where some limited gambling is allowed. So they could actually do lotteries via a video terminal.
Which would essentially, it's a fancy way of saying it's a slot machine.
Exactly. It is a slot machine. There are other types of games that this bill would allow, not only a state lottery, but multi-state lottery, instant tickets, scratch-off tickets, Keno, iLottery, and other lotteries that are offered in other states. So it kind of opens the door to quite a bit of different kinds of lottery-type gaming. Now, there's a bill that was put forth just recently, a different bill that was put forth by Senator Albritton. Right. And it's just one bill. Again, it is a constitutional amendment, but what it allows is only for paper lotteries. There's no video terminals or anything like that. So it's sort of it's a cleaner bill. It's not quite as long. It doesn't set up a commission like this first bill from Senator McClendon would do.
That's one thing I kind of wanted to ask about here. Would either of these bills actually set up a state-run lottery, or is it just opening the door for other lotteries that are already in existence to come into the state?
Well, the first bill, Senator McClendon's bill, it would not be state-run. It would all be run by a third party, so it's no state employees are involved in the running of this.
Okay.
Now, the second bill, believe it or not, it's shorter. I breezed through it really fast, and I don't know the answer to that right off the top of my head. I don't remember anything about a third party. I think it's going to be state run. So I'm not sure about that one, but I know for sure it's a third party that will run the second. Now, let me tell you, in Senator McClendon's bills, he does not have a fiscal note yet, but his estimates are that this lottery would raise 200 net, okay, after they pay all the prizes and all the advertising and all that goes into it. He thinks that the Alabama will end up with $200 million, and it will be split 50-50 between the Alabama Trust Fund and the Education Trust Fund. Now, that sounds like a lot of money. They're each going to get $100 million.
Right.
But when you break that down, that is only 1.5% that would go to the Education Fund. 1.5% of their budget. That's it. I mean, that's not very much money.
Right.
And then it would be 2.5% that would actually go to the general fund, because their budget is not as big as education.
Right.
So I really feel the negatives that a lottery brings, and we can talk about that too, really outweigh the good that it's going to do. You know, it's really not, it sounds like a lot of money, but in the scheme of things, it's not. And it's a limited amount of jobs that it will bring in. And when there have been studies done that show, for example, 7,000 new jobs are added, but the addiction rate is 20% higher than that. So you outweigh it with having addicted people than the amount of jobs that you have.
Well, and that's the thing too. And I think that there's probably some dishonest arguments going on both sides there. But one of the ones that I've heard really often is people that are proponents of the lottery or even full-scale casino-style gambling in the state of Alabama. Usually the way they frame it is, well, it'll do X amount of good things and it'll bring in X amount of money and jobs. And they basically treat it as though it would be some kind of silver bullet that will solve all our budgetary woes. But, I mean, the easiest way to defeat that argument is, well, Mississippi basically did that on steroids, and they're still trailing behind us in most categories. So the idea that gambling is just going to solve all our problems never made any sense to me.
Yeah, it's absolutely not going to. And as a matter of fact, lottery revenues decrease over time. That's just a fact. And even Senator McClendon acknowledged this in his press conference. So the first year you have a lottery is the year you're going to make the most money.
Right.
The older the lottery, the less money that it generates. So
that's the 200 million figure you just gave. That would be like the peak figure, right?
Yes. Now and that was just his estimate. He does not have a fiscal note from the Legislative Services Agency. Now, Senator Albritton's bill, there is a fiscal note on it, and it only comes to, I believe, $186 million. So it's less than McClendon's estimate. So it's not worth it. One of the things that is really problematic to me is that lotteries and gambling really prey on the poor. They are the ones that are most affected by it. They are the ones that you look at all the studies out there. They are the ones that buy the most tickets.
Right.
They are the ones that have the bigger gambling addiction. 61% of the low income, they're the ones who are buying more than half the lottery tickets. And, you can only have a few winners. And those winners will oftentimes go out and blow the money, and then, they go bankrupt. So I want to focus on solutions that are going to rise communities out of poverty. Let's focus on jobs. Let's focus on getting a good education and providing a good education. These are the things I think our legislature should really be working on. Another argument you hear is it should go to a vote of the people. But our argument for that is we have elected these people to represent us. And there are so many issues that are taken up at the State House. They're very complicated, some of them. They have a lot of nuances. And we pay for them to be up there, to study these things, to be able to make good decisions for us. And you know what? They didn't let us vote on the gas tax. So why are they copping out now and saying, oh, we'll just let you all vote on it, when you know that millions of dollars will be poured into TV ads, making it sound wonderful, that it's going to help education and it's going to take care of all of our problems. And people who don't, really know the facts, aren't educated on this, they're going to vote for it. And then pretty soon we're going to be like Mississippi, and, we're going to have more problems than we ever thought we would.
Well, not to go too meta here, but what you're talking about right there is essentially what was talked about by our founders in the Federalist Papers. that going to a
Absolutely.
direct democracy, just because a bunch of people vote on it and think it's a good idea, doesn't mean that it's a good idea. And that's the reason that we have representative republics. And Madison talked about that specifically in the Federalist Papers about people that are supposed to, it's their job. We essentially outsource being knowledgeable about these issues to other people that we feel will be a representative of our beliefs, but also have the expertise in them. And so
Right.
there is something to be said for that. But in this particular scenario, regardless of what happens, the people are going to have to vote on it because it's going to require an Alabama constitutional amendment. So that's kind of a moot point anyway, because even if it passed unanimously, you know, every senator and every member of the House and the governor signed on to a lottery bill, you would still have to have the people of Alabama to vote on it anyway.
Right. But if you get them to vote no and kill the bill,
right,
then we're in good shape.
Yeah, and I do think that's a better solution, because as much as I hate to say it, you and I both know this. For whatever reason, in the state of Alabama, pretty much everything that gets put on the ballot as a constitutional amendment passes. I mean, I hate to say that, but let's be honest. That's the reason why we have like 900 amendments to our Constitution.
Yeah, you're right. Why we have the largest Constitution in the world.
Oh yeah, it's not even close.
Alabama does have. Yeah, right. So you know, there's one other argument that I hear often, or that my constituents want it. They don't want to have to drive to another state. Well, it's the lottery conglomerates that help push that argument so that they can get into those states where there isn't a lottery. And my feeling too is, if you have citizens that are so upset and they want a constitutional amendment so that they can feed their gambling addiction to go play the lotto, then maybe there's an issue. Maybe there is something in their hearts they need to get right. If, you know, if they think driving 100 miles is too far and they'd rather just gamble at home. Oh, speaking, I'm sorry, Caleb, of gambling at home.
Well, and I'll say this, I just wanted to interject here. And you're right that it's these multi-state conglomerates that are making that argument. But here's the thing. You'll also hear the argument, and I've heard this one 1,000 times, I'm sure you have too, well, that money's being spent anyway. And because of that, what we should be doing is, if that money is going to be spent by Alabama citizens anyway, we need to open up the state to gambling. Well, here's the thing. If the exact same net amount of money was being spent on the lottery, those multi-state conglomerates wouldn't care whether it was legal in the state of Alabama or not. So clearly they believe they will be making more money if they open up gambling in Alabama, which kind of defeats that argument.
Right. And that's a great point. One of the things I just wanted to throw in here real quick is that in that first bill, Senator McClendon's bill, it does allow for iLottery, which is an online gambling that you can do at home or on the go. And again, this is one of those areas that Eagle Forum really cares about families. And we feel like when you don't have to go out to feed your addiction, or, you know, not everyone that plays the lotto, I'm saying that facetiously in a way, you know, not everyone's going to be addicted, but when you do have a gambling problem, once you're allow it to be able to do it in your home, you do it more often and get more addicted, and children can be enticed by this. So that was another one. You know, we're concerned about that being allowed to be in Alabama because we just don't need to open that door.
Well, and that's actually kind of a similar thing that we saw with the, not to get off topic here, but a similar thing when we're talking about addictions to the porn industry. Because what happened then is it was a very niche audience. There weren't many people that were willing to drive to like an adult bookstore or an adult video store to go buy that kind of thing. But once it's available in the privacy of your own home and nobody else will know whether or not you've been watching it or not, that really opened up the gates and really made it a much more profitable industry, because people that would have never been exposed to this stuff, you know, beforehand had that. So I can definitely see how someone, if they're already an addict or have a problem with this and are already prone to those tendencies, having it in their home could be far more devastating than having to go to the gas station and buy the tickets.
Yes, I totally agree with you.
Okay, so one of the things I wanted to ask about, have you heard anything in any of these bills, and there may be nothing in them, I don't know, I've just sort of heard rumors, that these bills would be giving permission for certain gambling machines or certain types of gambling to specific vendors? Because that was one complaint, and we've actually seen that with bills that came up before Alabama's House and Senate before. Luckily, they all failed. But have you heard anything about that? Do these bills contain anything about giving special permissions to specific vendors in the state?
There were no specific vendors mentioned in the state, but in McClendon's bill, it does set up a lottery commission, and they will be the group of people that will decide what games and what vendors. I'm sure they'll have a lot of money thrown at them to have, from the people who want their games to be the ones picked. But there's nothing actually in the bill that says who's going to do it. It doesn't even have a list of vendors in there. So,
okay.
And they're just looking at a lot of different states of what different states are doing. And, so they know who all the vendors are. And I'm sure
Right.
all of them will be parading in front of this commission to get their games in the state.
Yeah. So I was wondering, you kind of have your ear to the ground on this one. Do you think there's a high probability of this thing passing? Have you seen a lot of, I know you said that there were more anti-lottery people talking today, but was that representatives? Was that senator? Like, what are the odds that this actually winds up making it to the governor's desk?
This is just my total personal opinion. I could be 100% wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But I think out of all the years that they have tried to pass a lottery in the past or had some kind of bill even make it through committee,
mm-hmm.
I think this year is the year that it is most likely to happen compared to all those other years. There's a new set of people in the legislature, a lot of really good conservatives. So I'm not saying, it's filled with a lot of people that really are going to want this. But as you know, Caleb, over time, the culture is shifting. Things are changing.
Right.
I think there's a more openness to this kind of thing. I think it will pass out of committee. It did not. Today they had a public hearing in the tourism committee on these bills, but they did not vote. They just had a public hearing. So next Wednesday at their regular committee meeting is when they will actually vote to allow these bills to either die in committee or to a vote yes means that it will then go on to the Senate floor for full debate, and then the senators will actually vote on it. So next week, I will definitely have a better idea. I don't imagine that if it did pass out of committee on Wednesday, I don't think that it will actually be voted on the next day.
Right.
But I'll be on the show the next day, so I'll be able to tell you, I'll have a better idea of how those votes are going to land in the Senate. There's only 35 senators, so it doesn't, take a huge amount to get this passed.
Right. Well, all right. Well, I guess we'll check back with you next week when you have more information, and we certainly are looking forward to that. So I wanted to ask about this as well. There was, as I'm sure you're aware, a scathing DOJ report the other day. DOJ, not DOG. DOJ report. I don't know. I guess I had dogs on the mind. There was a DOJ report yesterday that was going after Alabama prisons and saying that there might actually be an Eighth Amendment violation there when it comes to cruel and unusual punishment. So what I was wondering is, I know that Representative Friddy, I believe, had said something about this. Have you heard anything about this? Do you see maybe legislation on the horizon to address these problems?
Well, absolutely. First of all, let me just explain my ignorance and let you know I did see headlines today. I've been at the State House Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. I saw the headlines today about the prison because there were a whole bunch of things coming out just recently.
Mm-hmm.
I did not stop and read them yet because I've got my head in these other things. But
right.
I do know that the governor, and I'm sure you heard in her inauguration speech, she is really concerned and she wants to build all these new prisons. And
right.
I'm wondering if the timing of these articles are to help push this legislation that's about to come down regarding the prisons. So I need to read through the DOJ's report. I know the AG is involved in this and something about they've given him 45 days to come up with some answers. And you know who would be great, Caleb, is Mike Holmes, Representative Mike Holmes. He'd be great to have on your show because he was part of that prison commission a couple of years ago that Bentley set up to really research what's happening in the prisons. He is not for building new prisons. There's so many bigger problems within the prisons that need to be fixed first.
Mm.
But he would be a great one for you to interview because he's got a lot of depth of knowledge specifically on that issue.
Well, I've actually had Representative Holmes on my show before, so I'm pretty sure I still have his contact information, and if not, I can find it. So
I'll send it to you. No
okay,
problem.
great. I knew you and he were friends, but I will check with him on that. Maybe we'll try to get him on sometime next week. But I appreciate that advice. I just, on this, I
He
do
can
think
just break it down and speak so intelligently about it, and kind of knows the backstory that so many people don't know.
All right, well, I will definitely try to get him on there. So one other thing that I wanted to ask about before, because our time is starting to run out here, what do you think about this new abortion ban that Representative Collins has called for?
I love it. I love it. It's bold. This is one of those bills that does not have a lot of exceptions.
Mm-hmm.
The only exception that this bill has is for the life of the mother.
Right.
And I'm sure you know, Caleb, that is extremely rare that ever happens.
Oh, yeah,
but
absolutely.
Basically, Terry Collins is the representative from Decatur who has put forth this bill, and she has put it in there bold enough that she wants this to be a challenge to the Supreme Court decision, Roe v. Wade. And I think, kind of like how gambling is turning a little more favorable in the state, I think that pro-life bills are beginning to see the light of day. I think this new generation is beginning to understand that babies in the womb do have feelings. They can feel pain,
mm-hmm.
and ripping their arms and legs off is not a humane thing to do, and that we need to stop doing this. So I'm hopeful. You've seen across the country,
right.
A lot of states are beginning to have these similar bills like this that are just going to, let's just say it, outright ban abortion.
Right.
So I think it's a great thing.
In Mississippi and Iowa, they have heartbeat bills that have already passed. In Georgia and Tennessee, they're working their way through their Congress. And the state of Alabama, if this winds up going to the governor's desk, and even though Kay Ivey and I have some disagreements, she's been very good on the issue of life. Yes. She'll probably sign it.
Absolutely.
That would mean we would have the most restrictive abortion laws in the country, if I'm correct on that.
Mm-hmm. And I know, Caleb, they are building a new Planned Parenthood facility in Birmingham.
Right.
They're almost finished with it. And there is going to be a prayer vigil, kind of the last stand before, everything is finally done up there,
mm-hmm.
to just pray against that. I will send you that information if you want to pass it on. It's at the end of April. I want to say maybe the 26th or 27th.
Certainly, yeah.
And they're just kind of a rally, just people to go up there and pray for the Lord to do his thing and shut down these awful practices of killing humans.
Well, now, of course, as awful and repugnant as a Planned Parenthood clinic opening in this state is, I do think it actually might wind up working in our favor. Let's just say, for instance, because banning abortion after 2 weeks, which this bill would do, would essentially make every service that Planned Parenthood offers in the way of abortion completely meaningless, and they wouldn't be able to make any money. So mm-hmm. Can you imagine what would happen and how rich it would be if this thing winds up passing and Planned Parenthood, right after building a brand new facility and wasting all that money, has to close their doors down? Mm-hmm. I mean, that would just be, I don't know, that would feel like divine providence, if you ask me.
Yeah, and then hopefully that building could be turned into a crisis pregnancy center.
Hopefully so.
Where, those could come get some good advice, and maybe even adoption agency in there. You just never know. Who knows? God works in mysterious ways. But
he does. He
I like
certainly
your
does.
thinking.
The thought of them opening their doors only to have to close them right back up again is just, incredibly satisfying to me for a number of reasons. So now, I did want to ask about this as well. And if you can't tell me, that's fine. What was going on that you were in D.C. for spring break? What was?
Oh,
yeah.
Well, as crazy as this sounds, I actually got an invitation from the White House to go to a meeting with some conservatives that I'm involved with in D.C.
Mm-hmm.
and to kind of have a sit down with. We were hoping that it was with President Trump. A few of the people in my group had met with him in January,
mm-hmm.
But we met with senior staff at the White House last Friday, and just kind of talked about the president's agenda with campus free speech and his feelings about the pro-life movement. He is very much in favor of banning abortion. This is something your audience can feel good about, as not having to feel like you need to persuade him to come on our side, because this is something that's very close to his heart. And it seems crazy. I would never have thought of him being that way. But
well, now, you remember you remember during the election, Becky, that I was actually never Trump. I didn't vote for the guy. And one of the main reasons that was the stance that I took is because I was skeptical about his views on abortion. He had a record of being pro-abortion for most of his life. But I got to say, the way that his administration has handled this issue, I was completely wrong. And I'm thrilled to be wrong on this.
Yes. Yes. And we all, I think, are surprised by it. But his senior staff even talked about, he was in, someone in this panel was with him when the news broke about the New York, they would actually kill the baby after it was born. And
right.
He was like, what are they talking about? Like, he was not understanding, are they saying what I think they're saying? And the staff was like, yeah, that's what they mean. They're going to kill him after he's born. And he's like, we are not having that. And he's just very passionate about life and whatever has happened in his life to make him change. And I think he's got an amazing wife, so maybe she's been working on him and having Pence as his vice president. And he loves to be prayed for. So I'm just happy that he's feeling the way he is. And I think one of the reasons I do what I do and that I work with Eagle Forum and have been in this movement for so long, it's all about life. It really, that I think is what God cares the most about, is his people, unborn and born, and, preaching the gospel and reaching people for Jesus. That's what we're here for. And that's our goal. And
right.
So I think, all these other things, marijuana, which we'll be talking about marijuana soon. There's medical marijuana bill on the table right now.
Right.
All these other side issues and budgets, and it's all going to burn. But pro-life and, worshiping God and allowing people to live and things like this, I think that's the most important thing.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more because, as you know, my big thing when talking about any policy issue is asking the question about, okay, does it make people freer or less free? But the thing is, if you don't respect the right to life, there is no liberty. You have to exist to have all of your other natural God-given rights and freedoms. And so if that is off the table, then there's no right that is safe. And so, yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And I'm glad to hear that the Trump administration seems to be on board with that and making that a big priority.
Me too. I was very thankful. So it was an honor to be there. They're going to start having quarterly meetings now. And so I may go back again. It was great. It was fun. And I was glad it was spring break at the legislature, so I didn't have to lose any time at work.
Right. I think that might have been the legislature's most productive week. But
yeah, I think so.
When they weren't there. But about the campus free speech thing, if I'm understanding that correctly, and since you've obviously just been through talking to some people on this, you probably know a lot more about it than I do. Essentially, what it just boils down to is the Trump administration is saying no more federal funding for campuses that censor speech.
Yes, and there's actually there's a lot of things in the works, but I will let you know that we are getting ready to drop a campus free speech bill in the legislature next week. So I look forward to talking with you about that. But when I got the invitation to the White House and found out that was one of the agenda items, I was so excited because the timing is so good. But again, this is where Trump steps in and says, you know what? These are places of learning where we need to be able to share ideas. People need to be free to hear the opposition, and people need to buck up and listen to the opposition. I mean, are they so afraid that the opposition might change their mind that they have to shut them down? That's what happens in socialist countries, and we don't want that.
And that's the thing that was so astounding to me, this idea that campuses ought to be places where nobody's ideas are challenged. And I've always thought that was the whole purpose of going to college, is that you had the things that you knew you kind of unknow or at least have challenged, maybe even not change your beliefs, but certainly reaffirm them through putting them through a fire.
Yes.
And
exactly.
So, yeah, I mean, it's just astounding to me that people now have this idea that campuses ought to be a place where nobody is being challenged. And I've always said, if you're not being challenged, then you're not thinking. So.
That's good.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Becky. I do appreciate it. And looking forward to our segment next week. Hopefully we'll know a little bit more about the lottery and what chances that bill has in actually going to the governor's desk, and then maybe even going to a vote of the people.
Yes, sounds great. And just to be looking ahead, we will have a great marijuana discussion, I hope, on your show, and then the campus free speech. These will be coming up in the next couple of weeks. So we got fun stuff to look forward to.
All right, excellent. Good to hear from you. Looking forward to hearing from you again.
All right, thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. That's Becky Gerritson with Eagle Forum, Alabama. As always, a pleasure to have her on, somebody that really knows her stuff, and we do appreciate her partnership. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and take a break, and we'll be back in just a moment.
Abby Johnson is in the other room.
Here.
Our first order of business is to present Planned Parenthood's Employee of the Year Award. Abby Johnson.
This is Abby. She's our newest volunteer escort. Abby, this is Cheryl D'Alessandro.
I'd be the youngest director in Planned Parenthood history.
You'll actually be in charge of the abortions at your clinic?
I have a chance to make a real difference.
No matter what you do for the rest of your life, you're still going to be a baby killer.
The only thing that's changed is you, Abby. Can you even hear yourself talk right now about these procedures? These are little babies.
I'm not going to apologize for doing a job that helps women in crisis.
There's still a part of me that isn't sure.
I know. But the one thing that all experts agree on is that at this stage, the fetus can't feel anything.
Sorry to bother you, but they need an extra person in the back room. Are you free? I saw it. And it was like it was twisting and fighting for its life.
We commend the souls of these hundreds of children. And Lord, we pray to end abortion.
I really appreciate what you've done for us. I'll not forget it.
22,000 abortions. How do I even comprehend that?
Rough day at the office?
You can say that.
You're making a mess.
It's your dad and me. You are our baby from the moment of conception.
We are paying you to be a perfect instrument of corporate policy. We are an abortion provider.
I can't be a part of this anymore. Everything that they told us is a lie.
Don't underestimate the repercussions of this. You gotta be careful.
Rhonda, please don't do this! Rhonda!
Let me tell you what's going to happen if you walk through that door.
Congratulations. You've made an enemy of one of the most powerful organizations on the planet.
And welcome back. Just so you know, the ads that I've been running this week for the movie Unplanned, which I highly, highly recommend you see. I've seen it. Excellent movie. Those are unpaid ads. I just wanted to let you know that, just you know, to fulfill my legal obligations, if anything else. I just put them out there because I'm wanting to promote the movie, not because I'm getting any kind of pay from that. So, that being said, there was another story that came out the other day that I think that it's not all that important on its surface, but it speaks to a larger truth underneath. And that's really why I think that it's important to cover, because a lot of people will ask why I put clips of certain news personalities or certain celebrities that talk about a certain issue, and they say, why would I care about their opinion anyway? Well, in this clip, it's not so much that you should care about the opinion of the political commentator, but I want to speak to a larger truth, a larger political discussion that can be found by really seeing what this represents. So it's really more about the representation than it is the actual clip itself, and I think you'll understand a little bit better once you watch it. This comes from the View yesterday in a segment they were doing, and just to give you a little bit of setup here, they actually start out with a pretty good and serious discussion with a guest who is a whistleblower inside the Trump administration. And the issue here is that there are 25 individuals that were highly suspect, and the State Department was very unsure about whether or not they should get security clearance, and then they wound up getting security clearance anyway. And the assumption that we can't prove yet, but the allegation that is being thrown around is that the Trump administration, Trump himself or somebody very close to him essentially went ahead and greenlighted these security clearances, even though there were some serious concerns with them. And that is a serious issue. And you'll hear them talk about it here, and they talk about that, but they kind of go off the rails, and you'll see what I mean in this clip. So this is from The View.
So the process of getting a clearance is very strict for a reason. My issue is the hypocrisy right now. I hate hypocrisy in politics, and if this were on the other foot, if this were the Obama administration, and this were 25 officials that had been denied or been, said we have concerns, and they still got overridden, this would be the top issue for every Republican right now in the country. And it should be for every single American.
None of this happens in the Obama. I've never when people say if this was Obama, nothing like this, even remotely close, ever happened in that administration. But completely scandal-free.
I think this type of thing, and
do you know a scandal? Can you name a scandal?
Yes, but I don't want to do this with you this morning.
I'd like to hear a scandal that.
But I think
right now the Iran deal, number one. I mean,
that's not a scandal.
Billions of dollars in unmarked bills in the middle of the night given to Iran. Yeah, that's a big scandal.
That was their money.
It was a bunch of other things.
That was their money.
I told you I didn't want to do this morning because, again, even just pointing out the fact that I don't think socialism is a winning adage for Democrats is a big issue this morning. By the way, props to Abby for this, okay? Because she asked a question that journalists around the country wouldn't do, that other people on other networks wouldn't do, and you got a big win, as I said before, and this will come back to haunt her. And that was what the subject of this. I'll give you an Obama scandal. He wore a tan suit. Michelle showed her arms, and he ate Grey Poupon. That's it. Okay. But I think part of the problem is for Republicans like me who are so put off by Trump, as everyone knows, and I hate Trump. I didn't vote for him before. I don't plan on voting for him the next time because of all the personal reasons. But I think the problem is when you put the Obama administration up as this pristine, scandal-free, perfect administration that never did anything wrong. For conservatives and Republicans, there were a lot of policies that were put into place. But I'm saying there was a lot of policies put into place that rational conservatives disagreed with. And I think part of the problem is it feels very judgmental. If you didn't like the Obama administration and you have a problem with the Iran deal, that's how you got Trump, is because you're lecturing all of us about us not thinking it was a pristine administration.
All right, so you can see in that, and I have to say, bravo to Meghan McCain. And I never get to say that because Meghan McCain and I do not agree on very much. I was not a fan of John McCain as a senator. I, opposed him on a lot of things. He was so moderate, he was virtually a Democrat. And Meghan McCain is kind of in that same mold. She's a very, very moderate Republican, very socially liberal on a lot of things. There's a lot of things that she and I disagree with. It's rare that I see something that Meghan McCain has said and go, yep, exactly right. But this is an occasion of that happening. This is one of those times. Meghan McCain, 100% on point with all of this. And like I said before this clip ever started, the issue that they actually start talking about is something that they could get rational conservatives on board with, is something that they could get someone who just wants to call balls and strikes and just wants to make sure that our government is running correctly and above board and that there's nothing fishy going on. This is a argument that the Democrats could actually gain some ground with those people. But they completely lose all their credibility when they start trying to compare it and say, well, this would never happen in the Obama administration and there was never a scandal. It was scandal-free for 8 years and everything was perfect. And then you heard Meghan McCain offer a counterpoint and talked about the Iran deal, which, by the way, was a pretty big scandal. Giving millions upon millions of dollars of dark money in the dead of night in a foreign currency to skirt our own laws against giving money to them. And considering that they are the biggest state sponsor of terrorism and very much on the path to getting a nuclear warhead, yeah, that's a big scandal. That's a big scandal by any objective person's standard. There is no rational thinking person, and I realize I'm talking about Joy Behar here, but you'll notice that she said that, and then the other person was like, yeah, the only Obama scandals were that he wore a tan suit and his wife showed off his arms. No, there were several very significant scandals in the Obama administration. Earlier in this same program, we had Becky Gerritson on, Eagle Forum, Alabama. Do you know what propelled her to national fame? Do you know what got her on the radar? The fact that she used to be the president of the Tea Party here in Wetumpka. And that she and hundreds of thousands of other people in this country, American citizens, had their government asking questions and stalling their tax-free status specifically because they ran organizations that did not agree with the president's agenda. That's something that we found out, and then magically when we go to investigate the IRS, somehow all of their computers simultaneously broke down and lost all their records all at the same time. You're telling me that that's not a scandal. You're telling me that the IRS being weaponized to attack the president's enemies right before and right when it would have been important in the 2012 election where he narrowly got reelected, you're telling me that that is not a scandal. And by the way, that's just stuff off the top of my head. I'm not even looking at a list of his scandals here. You could also talk about the Secret Service scandal where you had Secret Service agents employing foreign prostitutes and all kinds of other things that would have compromised his security. You can talk about the Hillary Clinton email scandal. Keep in mind, she was his Secretary of State when that was going on. You had senior level officials just magically losing 30,000 emails. You want to talk about hypocrisy in politics, which, by the way, the lady there that they had on as a guest that was talking about this, I agree with her. The fact that there are conservatives and that there are Republicans that are willing to just kind of look the other way on an issue when something comes up in the Trump White House, that is a real issue. But you can't sit there and lecture us about hypocrisy in politics and then sit there and say, but the Obama administration was completely scandal-free. No, that is the height of hypocrisy. Is it a big deal that there are 25 people with security clearance that may or may not need to have that security clearance? Yes, it is, and it's a serious issue and we ought to talk about it. But you're telling me that it's not a big deal that the highest ranking official in the State Department loses 30,000 emails and nothing happens to her and we never get those emails back? That's not a scandal? That's not a major security concern? You're talking about the scandal with the Secret Service? They're the people that are in charge of protecting the president's life. You're telling me that's not a security risk? Let's also not forget the spying on journalists. He spied on a Fox News journalist, a CBS journalist, and was wiretapping the AP. That's 3 separate incidents of the Obama administration using its muscle, using its power to go after journalists that had something to say about them or disagreed with them. And in the AP, let's be honest, the Associated Press wasn't exactly hard on Obama, but he still got caught wiretapping them. We could also look at the NSA scandal. You had James Clapper going on TV. Was the IRS collecting our metadata? No, sir. Found out that was a complete lie. Let's look at Benghazi. You had senior officials in the White House appointed by President Obama going out and telling people that the whole thing was started because of a video. That the whole thing started because there was an internet video that people over there in Benghazi didn't like, and they decided to go out and kill Americans. That was the narrative that they stuck with, even though we have records that showed they knew that was not the case. And they still jailed the guy illegally for producing the video. You're telling me all these things just aren't scandals. And actually, there are several others. That's just going off the top of my head. That's not even looking back at the list, because I've seen lists that would include 17. The 17 one was a little bit too generous on a couple of them. But one was put out by the Washington Free Beacon that had a record of 11. These were serious scandals. But I think it speaks to a larger political truth. And that's where I was going at the beginning of this segment to begin with. I was watching an interview, I don't know, maybe about a year ago, and it was with an activist who is a gay Muslim, so you can pretty much rest assured he's not exactly in the conservative camp. And this guy, and I can't for the life of me remember his name, he's good friends with Glenn Beck. He was doing an interview with him. And the same thing, there were media outlets saying that there were no scandals in the Obama administration and treating it as though it was this pristine model of how presidential administration should work. That's the way that they were presenting it. Multiple news sources on the mainstream media were saying that. And Glenn did this interview with this guy, very, very liberal, and he was talking about these scandals, and Glenn started talking to him just out of curiosity to see if he had ever heard of these scandals. And this is a guy that's in news. This is a guy who news is his business. The guy's a journalist. And Glenn rattled off several of the different emails, or several different emails, the email scandal and several others. And other than the Hillary Clinton email scandal, and that was partly because it became such a big deal in the election, he had never heard of most of these scandals. He had no idea that the IRS was targeting people. And the reason is because he lived in a world, and this is by his own admission, he was living in a world, he was living in a bubble that did not allow those stories to penetrate that bubble. So in Joy Behar's case and the other host on The View besides Meghan McCain, maybe that's kind of the world that they're living in too. Maybe what's going on there is they really believe that it's scandal-free because they never heard of those stories. The mainstream media just decided those stories weren't interesting enough for them to publish. And that's why people don't trust the media, and that's why I think that we get so frustrated when trying to communicate with people on the other side of the aisle, is we can't even agree on the basics. And part of the reason that a lot of people that are Obama supporters and were big fans of his, they really do think that his administration was completely scandal-free, not because they're idiots or not because they are willfully turning their back on those things and saying, well, those weren't scandals. It seems that Joy Behar is in the case of the Iran deal. But if you're looking at this and the other side is seeing a completely different picture, and they don't even see the scandals because they've never heard of them, they never even saw a news story that talked about them, then they're not being intentionally difficult and they're not dismissing something that may really be a scandal. They're just ignorant. Now, is that an excuse? Not really. But the point is, we have to be aware of that when we're having conversations with other people. Because when they say, well, the Obama administration wasn't like this, it was completely scandal-free. Maybe it's important for us to bring up, and do so in a more polite way, to keep in mind that it may be that they really haven't heard about it. And all the scandals that I listed, those weren't just conspiracy theories or things that I pulled off of conservative media sites. These are all well-documented scandals. And there are, I'm sure, a lot of conspiracy theories out there. I mean, for goodness sake, there's conspiracy theories that Dick Cheney was the one that orchestrated the 9/11 attacks. So, yeah, there's conspiracy theories out there, I'm sure. But each one of the ones that I just listed, the ones that we just talked about, these are all well documented. You can look through any of them. I encourage you, do your own homework. Double check me on this. But this is the problem that we're running into, is that as conservatives and liberals, we sometimes get stuck behind that bubble, and we don't even hear about stories from the other side. We don't even hear about stories that don't confirm the beliefs that we already have, and that really is a travesty, and we do so to our own detriment. But it also illustrates something else. Whether it's ignorance or whether it's intentionally sweeping it under the rug and pretending that things that really should be considered scandals are not scandals, I do think that it's important for us to note here that this is a classic example of the Democrats overplaying their hand. Like I said on the onset, I think the issue that they actually started talking about is really important. I think that it is a big issue, and it is something that ought to be discussed. However, they completely took essentially everybody that was paying attention that may be sort of on the fence or sort of center-right all the way up to conservatives completely out of that conversation because they said something that was blatantly false. Now, is it fair to say that if this had happened in the Obama administration, it would be a big deal? Yes. In fact, if that had happened in the Obama administration, I probably would have included it in the list that I just gave you of scandals. So I'm not saying that there aren't some people on the right with a double standard. However, to go way beyond making that point and go to the nth degree of saying the Obama administration was perfect and the only thing that anyone ever complained about with him was having his wife's arm showing and wearing a tan suit, that's ludicrous. That's the problem that you're running into, because as soon as you said that, basically every conservative just completely shut you out and knows that they shouldn't take you seriously. They know that what the comparison that you're making is so insane and so untrue, so detached from facts, that now they can't even take your original point seriously. Or at the very least, they're far more skeptical of the coverage that you're giving to it. And so this is a problem that the Democrats have, and frankly, I mean, to some degree, it actually is a good thing politically for Republicans, because they constantly overplay their hand. They start out on common ground. They start out on an area that we, might actually have some room to agree on. And then they completely distract from that by talking about something that a conservative knows, okay, this person is just a political shill. And that's exactly what Joy Behar is. And so because of that, this is the problem that Democrats typically run into. And if Democrats continue to do this and continue to try to hold up the Obama administration as this perfect paramount of moral character, then they're going to lose. Because anybody that's not a far left progressive knows that that isn't the case, knows that there were significant failings of the Obama administration. And so because of that, I think that it really does speak to especially those in the sort of liberal bubble that Joy Behar runs in, being completely unconnected from a vast majority of the middle of the country. So, speaking of Democrats winning and losing, it looks like Beto O'Rourke is under fire for paying $110,000 to his own company. So there was a company that was started back in 1998, so I'll just go ahead and read this. This is according to the Federal Election Commission records. Beto O'Rourke, his political campaigns since 2011 paid nearly $110,000 to Stanton Street Technology Group, a company founded by O'Rourke in 1998, and later led by his wife, Amy Sanders O'Rourke. So the reason that this is problematic is specifically because it seems as though this is done for personal enrichment. And the CEO of the company now, the one that was contacted by, I believe it was Fox News that ran this story, the ones that contacted him, he said, well, it would have really been something scandalous if he had overpaid for it. Well, granted, that would be worse, and I don't know whether or not this $110,000 is overpaying or not, but if you're taking donated money, donated either by individuals or donated by corporations, and that is supposed to be used for your campaign, even if you are using a company that you built and you founded for legitimate purposes, and in this case what they're saying is that it was social media advertising, that kind of thing, which maybe it was, I don't know, and maybe $110,000 is a fair price for that, I'm not sure. But the point is, don't you understand that it kind of raises some eyebrows when you pick your own company to do something like that? It may have been a lot smarter, just if anything else, to get rid of the appearance of wrongdoing, to use a company that you didn't found and your wife was not working at. So that's the allegation right now. That's what's, causing a lot of buzz. I don't know if there's impropriety here or not, but it certainly doesn't look good. And if you're going to just advice for all future politicians, if you're going to spend some money, especially a large sum of money like that, you should probably use companies that you don't own. And keep in mind, this is exactly what got our former Speaker of the House, Mike Hubbard, in trouble. Now, granted, it was a little different because at that point he was using taxpayer dollars, not donated money. But either way, you're using money and putting it into a business that enriches your personal wealth. And that seems to be the problem. And, O'Rourke has actually had sort of a reputation. I know that nationwide people aren't really aware of this, but if you're looking at some of the news coverage of him locally and in the state of Texas where he's been a representative for a number of years, when you're looking at that, he kind of has a reputation of some of this corrupt business practices. That it may not technically be illegal, but it's certainly shady, and it could be illegal. And that's really something that I think O'Rourke is going to have to address if he's going to be a serious contender for the Democrat seat. And by the way, Biden's not in yet, and he still may not run. So if I had to look at it now, and the polls kind of reflect this, Beto O'Rourke, who is phenomenal at fundraising, he may suck at everything else, but he's really good at fundraising. Beto O'Rourke and Bernie Sanders, I would have to say right now, are kind of the Democrat frontrunners. The top four seem to not change regardless of what poll you're looking at, but you see some back and forth between O'Rourke and Harris, but it seems that Bernie and O'Rourke, Bob Francis O'Rourke, are pretty much neck and neck. And if Biden doesn't get in, and I still think Biden he's interesting because I think the only way that he can win a primary, because they think of him as not necessarily being radical enough, which I know it's insane that the left thinks that Joe Biden is too conservative. Think about how crazy that is. But in the primaries, Joe Biden's best bet is essentially to bill himself the same way that Donald Trump billed himself in the primaries, which is, I'm the guy that's going to take down Hillary Clinton. And with Biden, I think that the best way he could market himself and the best thing that he has going for him is he says, look, in a general election, I'm the one that has the best numbers against Donald Trump. I'm the one that's most likely to get Trump out of the White House. And if he can sell that message effectively, then Biden essentially, I think, has a very, very good shot at securing the nomination. But if Biden doesn't get in, and he may not, he's getting pretty old. If Biden doesn't get in, it's probably against O'Rourke and Sanders. And Sanders, he has a very loyal base, and there's going to be a little bit of that revenge vote factor. So I wouldn't count Sanders out. In fact, if I had to pick somebody, gun to my head right now, who I think is going to get the nomination, I would say Sanders. But O'Rourke is probably his biggest contender other than Biden. And like I said, Biden hasn't declared that he's running yet. So that being said, especially looking at his ability to fundraise and his ability to, he appeals to younger people, he appeals to older voters. He's got very much of a Marco Rubio of the left kind of feel to him. And so personally, it just seems to me like O'Rourke is going to be very much a contender. Bob Francis O'Rourke, he may wind up actually being the nominee. And so this is a serious concern for someone who is a front runner on the left. Now, according to news sources and according to the people over there at this company that he founded, they're saying that right now he has no intentions of using his campaign money to use them for the 2020 campaign, but still, you got to look into the allegations that he's been doing this in the past. And I think that's something to seriously consider. So, that being said, since this is kind of a segue, we go now to the Daily Dose of Stupid.
No, you messed it up. You're stupid.
And the reason that I said that was a good segue is because the Daily Dose of Stupid today is about Bob Francis O'Rourke. So Bob O'Rourke, otherwise known as Beto, he was doing a talk the other day and he had a question from the audience about whether or not he thought the Electoral College should be abolished. Here was his answer.
Each other, and we were like, how are we going to explain to Ulysses and Molly and Henry, who are now 12, 10, and 8, that the person who got 3 million more votes just lost the election? And then we were...
No, you...
To answer your question, yes, let's abolish the Electoral College. The night after the presidential election in 2016, Amy and I were talking to each other, and we were like, how are we going to explain to Ulysses and Molly and Henry, who are now 12, 10, and 8, that the person who got 3 million more votes just lost the election? And then we were talking to each other, and we're like, how do we explain that to ourselves? Like, why is this okay? This is one of those bad compromises we made at day one in this country. And there are many others that we can think of, and they are all connected, including the value of some people based on the color of their skin. There is a legacy and a series of consequences that have persisted and remain with us to this day. And this conversation about how we repair the damage, how we make things right, and how we keep from committing the same injustices going forward is squarely connected to the reason that we are all convened here today, and that is fixing our democracy. So yes, if we got rid of the Electoral College, we get a little bit closer to one person, one vote in the United States of America.
All right, so Bob O'Rourke giving a thrilling history lesson that is, well, completely false and void of all history, gets just everything wrong about the Electoral College in that little segment. So here's the problem. First of all, it's pretty easy to tell where this is coming from. It's very easy to tell that this is essentially just sour grapes. I mean, he basically admits to as much in the beginning of that clip. You'll hear him say that, well, it was about the last election when we started talking about this. And so, in other words, he never had a problem with the Electoral College until it caused Hillary Clinton to not be president of the United States. And this is true of all Democrats. It's just Bob O'Rourke actually just said it and verbalized it. The problem that they have with the Electoral College is that it has helped Republicans. And that's the issue that they really take with it. They wouldn't have a problem with it per se. It's just, well, Hillary Clinton's not president because of it, ergo, it must be a problem. This is nothing but sour grapes after the 2018 election. But here's the problem, too. Rather than actually currying the favor of voters and trying to work within the system, they would rather just break the system down. They're saying that, well, the system that we have is causing problems for us or has caused problems for us in recent history, ergo there must be a flaw in the system. That doesn't mean necessarily that there's a flaw in the system. That means that you need to work within the structure, work within the rules that were set to be able to do. I mean, that would be like saying, if your basketball team loses a game, saying, well, the problem is the hoops were too high. We need to lower them to 8 feet. Well, the other team had a 10-foot hoop too. Doesn't matter. The problem is the way that the game is designed. Yeah, but you knew at the beginning of the game, you knew going into it that they were going to be 10 feet high. But we only practice with 8 feet goals. Why would you do that? Why would you do that? You knew the goals were going to be 10 feet high in the game. Why would you practice with 8-foot goals? See, they're acting as though this great injustice has happened to them because they lost the election. And the problem is they're really just sore losers. They can't believe the fact that somehow, and granted, I was a little bit in shock myself, that Donald Trump actually somehow wound up pulling off winning the presidential election. But that is an excuse to fall back, do some self-reflection, and then get better. Not to say, well, the game was unfair. The game was rigged. And what's so hilarious is we had over and over and over again Democrats telling us Republicans have to accept the results of the election. They have to accept them. They have to accept that it was fair. And the reason they were saying that was because they believed that Hillary Clinton was going to win. They say anything that Donald Trump is suggesting about there being voter fraud, well, that's just un-American, and that it really attacks the integrity of our institutions. Which, by the way, at the time, I said it, when he was running, I agreed with that sentiment. However, they're saying the exact opposite now. Somehow this, changing the Constitution and the way we do a presidential election, is not attacking the Constitution, is not attacking the institution of the way that we elect presidents. That's not saying that there's a problem with the system. Their standards change based on who is saying it and whether or not they like that person at the time. And it all boils down to a problem that Democrats have with the way that our system is designed. We are not a democracy. He said we need to get closer to one person, one vote. Well, yeah, getting rid of the Electoral College would do that, but that doesn't make it a good idea. That is not in and of itself an argument to the superiority of a direct democracy. In fact, if you're looking at Madison's Federalist number 10, you will see why, and he makes some very powerful arguments in that particular letter, as to why democracy itself is evil, why it always ends in tyranny. We're not supposed to be a direct democracy. We were never designed to be a direct democracy. We are a representative constitutional republic. That's the form of government that we have. If you don't like it, then you need to advocate for a full-on democracy in everything, which, by the way, is a horrible idea. But if that's what you want, you need to be honest about what you actually want. We're not a democracy. We're a republic. Anyway, I love this one analogy that he used in that clip. Well, how are we going to explain this to our kids? How are we going to explain that the person that got 3 million more votes lost? It's actually very simple. The same way that you explain a baseball game to a child. If a child walks up to you watching their first baseball game and saying, I don't understand, the team that hit the ball more didn't win, that seems unfair. Then you explain to that child, well, it's not the team that hits the ball the most that wins. It's the team that makes it home the most. It's the team that gets the most runs. See, that's the thing. When you're talking about the contest of an election, everybody knew that the Electoral College was the way that the president has decided going into it. So you would describe that the same way that you would describe the results of a baseball game. It doesn't matter how many people got to first base. It doesn't matter how many people hit the ball. It doesn't matter how many amazing catches the other team made when they were on defense. The only thing that matters is how many times a person was safe at home. One team could have 2 hits, one team could have 100 hits. As long as that team has more runs, doesn't matter how many hits the other team got, they won. Everybody agreed on those terms long before Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump went at it on the presidential stage. Everybody knew that was the way that it was going to go. And to blame the rules and to blame the system is essentially them just having sour grapes about losing. That's how you explain it to a child. It's not that hard. It's not that complicated. Furthermore, he has his history completely wrong for a number of reasons, because what he's trying to do is he can't actually explain why the Electoral College is bad. And so the only way that he thinks he can do it is he has to default to one of the only things that Democrats know how to do, and that is claim that things are racist. If anything is unfair, well, it must be because of racism. If anything that they perceive is incorrect, well, it's because of racism somehow. But on this one, he's completely wrong. He's saying that this was a compromise that we made from day one. Well, if you're looking at the Constitution, there were a lot of compromises made. Some of them were based on the institution of slavery. This was not one of them. And the way that you know that is because he's trying to lump the 3/5 compromise and everything else into the compromise for the representation of states, and he's trying to lump it into the way that we select presidents by the Electoral College, but that's not the case. This was a compromise not between slave and free states. This was a compromise between large states and small states. Because what was going on is the smaller states were saying, well, if we just base it on population, if we just do a popular vote, then certain states that are smaller are not going to be recognized, and our votes are essentially going to be worthless when it comes to electing a president. And they were right. It was a legitimate complaint. So in the same way that they made a compromise between large and small states by having a House of Representatives and a Senate, they also made a compromise when it came to selecting the executive branch, the president. And so in both the legislative branch and the executive branch, they decided we need to figure out a way to represent the states as sovereign institutions and the population of those states. That's how the Electoral College came about. It represents the population because the amount of electoral votes you get is based on your population, but it also gives some representation to you as a state, as a separate sovereign entity. That's how the system works. And that's the reason that it was set up the way that it was. Now, Democrats, as a general rule, don't like this because they would rather us be one giant homogenous nation where the states are essentially just the only thing that matters for them is your address. They're just meaningless names, and you don't really have sovereign states that have individual powers. They would rather centralize power in Washington, and that's the reason that they really hate the institution of the Electoral College, and also the reason that they're trying to get rid of other compromises that were reached in the name of small states versus large states. There are, and granted, this is not a majority, but there are Democrats right now that are saying we should abolish the Senate. We should just have a House of Representatives. That should be the entirety of Congress. This is actually a talking point that some Democrats are starting to latch onto because they hate the idea of states as sovereign entities. And part of the reason for that is because they would rather consolidate as much power as humanly possible in Washington, D.C. And by the way, on this accusation that it was somehow tied to slavery, here's a really big problem with making that argument. Here are the states at the time of the Constitution's ratification. Here are the states that would have had the fewest votes: Delaware, Vermont, Rhode Island, Georgia, New Hampshire, New Jersey. Now, what do you notice about that? What do you notice about that list? These are the smaller states that would have benefited from not having a popular vote. These are the states that would have seen the most benefit from having this representation in the Electoral College. Anybody pick up on it? There's only one state that was in the South, and it's Georgia. Georgia is the only state that had that small population that would have greatly benefited from having an Electoral College. Now, let's look at the larger states, states with the most electoral votes, which would have been disadvantaged. In other words, it would have been better for them representation-wise to just have a popular vote. Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts, North Carolina. In that list, you have Virginia, arguably the largest slave-holding state and the most pro-slavery state in the Union at the time, and you also have South Carolina, which was another big slave state. So, on the list of states that got the most advantage from the Electoral College, you've got a bunch of tiny New England states and Georgia. And on the states that were disadvantaged by the Electoral College, you've got larger states, two of which happen to be really big slave states. And so this idea that the Electoral College was supposed to institute slavery, and it was done as a compromise between slave states and free states to try to keep slavery as long as possible, that's easily disprovable by looking at the history. The states that would have got the most advantage from it would have been the small New England states. It just doesn't make any sense at all. In fact, you can also look at the actual results of what happened because of the Electoral College. And if you're looking at the pre-slavery era, there were actually two that did not win with the popular vote. John Quincy Adams and Abraham Lincoln, both very outspoken anti-slavery presidents. They didn't win the popular vote. And in Abraham Lincoln's case, it had to go to the House of Representatives. But the point is, if it had just been a popular vote, whoever wins the most votes gets the presidency. Neither of those two men would have ever been president. And they were very outspoken anti-slavery presidents. And so looking through this assumption, this fiction is the only way to describe it really, that the Electoral College was put in to institutionalize slavery and it was done to try to help slave states, there's absolutely no truth to it whatsoever. Here's the problem. If you don't like the Electoral College, we can have that debate. I'm willing to have that debate with anybody. But suggesting that it is the product of racism, that's just a lie. And the only reason that they're repeating that is because they know that they have to figure out a way to get people drummed up and to turn sentiment against it. And they can't do that on solid, honest political grounds. So what they have to do is they have to lie about it and paint it as though it's some kind of institution of racism, which is just simply not true. It's a completely dishonest way to have this discussion. Now it's time for the Chaplain's Report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Today's Chaplain Report comes from the book of Daniel. We're going to continue the series that we started in the book of Daniel. And for those of you who may not have caught every part of it, it's a story that I'm sure you're familiar with. The king commands Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to worship at the feet of this idol. They refuse. As punishment, he throws them into the fiery furnace. And the passage that we just looked at is after they have come out, they realize that they have not been hurt by the fire and that they have not even been affected by the fire. And this is how the king reacts to it. For this, we go to the book of Daniel, chapter 3, verses 28 through 30. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants, who put their trust in him, violating the king's command, and yielded up their bodies so as to not serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree that any people, nation, or tongue that speaks anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses reduced to a rubbish heap, inasmuch as there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way." Then the king caused Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to prosper in the providence of Babylon. The reason that this particular part of the story is so moving and important is because it shows the change that God's power has in the life of this king. Someone that doesn't know God, has been a pagan his entire life. He now understands. And granted, this is a lesson, unfortunately, that Nebuchadnezzar is going to have to learn and relearn and unlearn. Nebuchadnezzar is a very inconsistent figure in the scripture. But at least in the immediate aftermath of seeing this miracle, he seems to be very convicted that he understands that God really is the one that is in control. Now, he's already seen Daniel interpret dreams. And as amazing as that was, this is something where he can see actual physical evidence of a miracle taking place. And because of that, he is really astounded. And this is about as big a turnaround as you could ever have. We see Nebuchadnezzar beforehand saying, anybody that doesn't worship my God and my idol, they will be punished and they'll be thrown into a furnace, to going so far the opposite way, saying anybody that even disrespects the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is going to suffer my wrath. Now, to be fair, granted, this is a horrible thing if you're talking about freedom of religion, but, ancient Babylon didn't exactly have a First Amendment at the time. So this is the decree that the king makes. He goes from mocking Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's God to having the utmost respect for him and saying anybody that does mock is going to face the penalty for doing so. So he does a complete 180 here. And I would say that in the larger biblical narrative, Nebuchadnezzar is somebody that seems to be a pretty impulsive man. His beliefs seem to sway to and fro very quickly, and so he is sort of prone to these big sweeping changes. But the point is, even though this change may be impulsive, and we're going to see later that he stops respecting God and stops revering him as he did when he saw the miracle of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we do see that the power was enough to convict him, if nothing else, just in this moment, of how powerful God is in comparison to him. And one thing that I wanted you to notice too is that he says that there is no God that is able to deliver like this. And this is something where some cultural context really comes in handy. Because the vast majority of pagans, of which Nebuchadnezzar was one, their beliefs were sort of that there are lots of gods, and there are so many gods that we don't even know how many they are. And they kind of believed that the gods were either incapable or unwilling to actually meddle in the affairs of man. And let's be honest, the reason for that was pretty clear. The reason that they believed those things is because they had never seen a God that could actually do something. We see this countless times in the Bible where people were worshiping things that weren't God, and then God shows how powerless and how empty these handmade idols, these things that are designed and worshipped by men but don't actually exist, are. And you see here an example that the pagans themselves didn't even really believe that their gods were all that powerful. We saw earlier in this same passage that Nebuchadnezzar said, "What God is there that can deliver you?" In other words, this is not a guy who's an atheist. He believed in other gods. He just didn't believe that there was a God powerful enough to stop his will. He didn't believe that there existed a God that was going to be able to save Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So he wasn't saying there are no gods. He was just saying there's not a God that's actually powerful enough to stop me from doing what I want. And so it's a very, very different mindset than what we have today. And now he realizes not only is there a God that can stop him, there is a God that is so much more powerful than him that he needs to pay reverence to him. And he believes that his nation needs to do the same thing. So at least for some time, God was revered in the nation of Babylon because of this great miracle that the king witnessed. And I do want to point to verse 30 as well. That God had them prosper in this land. That after this, because of this show of faith where they said, no, I will not worship any God other than the true God. And if it costs us our life, it costs us our life. If it means we have to die for this, so be it. That's the kind of conviction that God respects, and it seems based on this, it's a conviction that Nebuchadnezzar respects as well. Because he went from thinking that they were crazy for even attempting to defy him in the name of their God to praising them for their defiance. Think about that. We see this in this passage. He is saying, man, it is amazing that they decided to defy me in service of their God, and that their God rewarded their faith by sending his angel to protect them. That's Nebuchadnezzar's observation of the situation, and he's right. And so he respects their God now, and he also respects their faith. He respects the conviction that they had to say, no, this is wrong, and we're not going to do it no matter what you say. We are not going to cross that line. We are not going to defy our God. And Nebuchadnezzar really respects that out of them. And I think that that's an important thing to note too. That we are going to gain respect and we're going to be able to prosper in a certain way. And I'm not a fan of the prosperity gospel, you know that. But our situations and what surrounds us is not as important as our faith. And even though Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were in a position where it was not looking good for them, they were in a position where it looked like they were going to come into harm. And even though they were in a position that most Jews would have never wanted to be in, being taken away from their homeland, being taken away from the promised land, and put in a foreign nation surrounded by pagans, the faith and the strength of their conviction caused them to prosper in this land. And even though Nebuchadnezzar didn't really share their faith, or at least not the way that he should have, he did respect them. And if we as Christians do this, even when we're surrounded by people that don't share our faith in Christ, even when we're around people that do act immorally and don't share our common set of values, if people see you day in and day out, your coworkers, the people that you come in contact with every day, if they see the strength of your conviction and your faith, even if they don't agree, they will respect you. They'll respect the fact that you have enough faith to live your life differently than everybody around you. That's something that does encourage that kind of respect. And if that takes place, if that respect and that basis is there, then when they start asking questions, guess who they're going to come to? Having this conviction is important because people know that you are a person that takes your faith seriously. And if they ever have any questions about faith, if they ever have any questions about this God that you serve, they're going to go to you because they know you're the real deal. They know you're somebody that is serious about dedicating their life to following God. It's not just lip service for you. It's something that you actually live out, just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And if we live that kind of life, there's no telling how many people we can bring a little bit closer to God and understanding his will, just like they did with Nebuchadnezzar. Stay the course, friends.
This is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Any opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media. The theme song for Tactics is 6 Foot Town by Big and Rich. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Broadcast studios provided by Cumulus Media Montgomery. Location studios provided by the Dalraida Church of Christ. Copyright 2019.